You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
When it comes to Holy Tradition, there are separate yet united traditions or parts that make up the whole, varying in degrees of authority. For example, Scripture, ecumenical councils, church music, and art. Would you gentlemen say all these are inspired? And these two words is what I'm focusing on, really. Inspired and inerrant sources of authority. Or is that even terminology that we would even use in the first place? And Father John, I'll kick that over to you first. What do you think about inerrant and inspired?
Well, I think when we talk about tradition, we have to make some distinctions because we use the word in different senses. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you hear people talk about big T traditions and little T traditions, but yeah, I think that could be misleading because sometimes people will say, well, that's just a little T tradition, and it's just because they don't like it. But when we're talking about apostolic tradition, these are the traditions that the church received from the apostles, which they were taught by Christ. And so there's no doubt about the fact that apostolic tradition would be authoritative and inerrant. Mm-hmm. But there's another kind of tradition which is also authoritative and inerrant as well, and we would say ecclesiastical tradition, the sense of things that are universally affirmed by the church. So that would be especially things that are decreed by ecumenical councils or fathers that the ecumenical councils affirmed. Mm-hmm. And so not everything in an ecumenical council would necessarily have been an apostolic tradition. So, for example, we know that there were married bishops in the early church. We know that St. Peter had a wife, for example.
Right.
But as the church went through its history, very early on, you had bishops who were married whose wives would be made deaconesses or they would become nuns. And it was because there was an understanding before it became a decree that being a bishop and being a married man raising children was not something that worked together very well. And so then eventually it became an established standard that to be a bishop, you had to be a monastic. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have married bishops today, at least not bishops that are currently married. We have bishops who have been married. Usually their wives have reposed when they're made a bishop.
Sure.
But we wouldn't say that's an apostolic tradition, but it's an ecclesiastical tradition that the church as a whole has affirmed. Then you could also talk about traditions that may or may not be true. For example, there's a tradition that St. Joseph of Arimathea went to England with Christ when he was a young man, and that you have lots of traditions related to that. For example, the Glastonbury thorn is supposed to have originated from him having stuck his staff into the ground and then it sprouted. Okay. Well, that's a cool tradition, and yeah. I have no objections to it being true, but I would not say that that's something that is infallibly true or that everybody would have to affirm to be true, because it may be true, but it may not be true. It's a tradition. Mm-hmm. And then there are also local traditions. So you could talk about the fact that, for example, in the Russian church, when people take communion, they'll kiss the chalice after they take communion. But in the Greek church, they don't kiss the chalice after they take communion. And they actually both practices have the same rationale behind it, which is respect for the Eucharist. But the Russians kiss the chalice, which is what clergy do actually after they kiss the chalice. Mm-hmm. I mean, after they take communion in the altar, even Greek clergy do that. Okay. So they're showing their respect for the Eucharist. But in Greek practice, they don't kiss the chalice because there's a concern where you might get some of the mysteries on the outside of the chalice. And so but those neither one of those you would say, well, if you don't agree with that, you're a heretic or anything like that. It's a local custom, and there are even local customs within a parish. That in our parish we do this, but obviously it's not a universal tradition of the church. So these have varying degrees of authority. And if you talk about iconography, for example, there are certain there's something about iconography that you could say, well, this is universally the practice of the church, because there are some icons that there's no disputes about. But on the other hand, there's icons that don't have long histories that some people would say, well, that shouldn't be painted that way, and other people would say, yeah, it's fine. So it depends, and in terms of like the hymnody of the church, I would say hymns that the whole church uses, you would at least have to say that there's no doctrinal error in those hymns. There might be historical errors, for example, because maybe there might be a hymn that talks about a saint and says something that may not be precisely true of history or something like that. But the church as a whole certainly would not be using hymns that were expressing heretical teachings.
Right.
And so varying degrees of authority depending on which type of tradition we're talking about.
Okay. Would one of the traditions like that also, because I know and so I say this thinking back on the conversation that I had with Craig Trulia about different traditions and things like that. And he sounded surprised, and I can't remember which parish he mentioned by name, but he said that I think it was during, and I know one of y'all guys can help me out. Jeremy, I know you could help me out with this one. But where we read different, in different languages, I think it's John chapter 20, verses 19 through 25. In our parish, we read them like in, it's a lot of different languages. And Craig seemed kind of surprised by that. So do all parishes do that kind of thing, or not so much?
That's actually a Greek practice.
Okay.
But the Russian practice is actually on Pascha night when you read at the liturgy, when you read the Gospel of John, which is the first chapter of John. I think it's like the first 18 verses or something like that.
Okay.
That's read in many languages.
Gotcha.
The Greeks, the one thing about the difference between Greek and Russian practice is usually when there's a difference, the Russians are doing it the way that the Greeks that evangelized the Russians taught them to do it. So the Russians often are preserving an older Greek practice, but I suspect that the practice of reading the gospel that's done at the Agape Vespers in many language probably originated from the fact that if you read the gospel in many languages at the liturgy that's in the wee hours of the morning, you're just making the service that much longer. Whereas the following day, when people have had a chance to get some rest, to read that gospel in many languages is a lot easier to handle. Although obviously the gospel reading that you read at the liturgy on Pascha is one that is like, this is a powerful gospel talking about the incarnation of Christ, and to read that in many languages probably makes most sense, liturgically. So I do think the Russian practice is probably the older practice, but there's a practical reason, I think, for the Greek practice.
Okay, fair enough. All right, I want to kick this over to Father Joseph and get his views on this first question as well. Father Joseph, I can repeat the question if you want me to, but I'm really concerned, and because this is a conversation that has came up between co-hosts on this show, specifically between me and my co-host Dale, and he makes like this basically, and I know he might be watching. I haven't seen him comment in the live chat. But I think, and he can correct me if I'm wrong later, and then I can maybe ask you in private, or if we're not on this episode, ask you then. But he seems to have this idea that it's either everything that Orthodox Christians would consider tradition, whether it's big T, little t, or however we would phrase that, has to be inerrant, specifically, or quote unquote inspired. And I know we use the term inspired, so I guess I'm more focused on inerrant. What are your thoughts about that?
It's a great question, and it's a very logical one. I mean, of course, when we look at dogma, the central truths of the faith, like the death, the resurrection, the deity of Christ. We don't merely see patristic consensus, we see patristic unanimity. You're not going to find any saint denying the deity of Christ. You're not going to find any saint denying that he died and rose again. And it would be easy to assume, as many people do, that we think, well, since the consensus of the saints gets the big questions right, then if we trust in what they say about the dogmas, then shouldn't they get everything right? Shouldn't the saints get every minor historical detail, every small t tradition, every every little detail about history or science correct? And the fact is that's not the case. But it's important to understand why that's not the case. And we could have a whole show just on that one question. We could go as deep as we want just on that one question.
Sure.
But just a broad view of it. If you deny the deity of Christ, you're going to be excommunicated. You're going to be thrown out of the church. Yeah. You're definitely not going to be canonized as a saint. So there's a filter, and it's not just a human filter. Christ gave a promise. He said, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Yeah. So if the entire church, which we're going to define that as the saints, which as we said, we would save that topic for another show. But once we figure out who the saints are, they're not going to defect. You're never going to look at the saints and say, you know what? Some of them think Jesus is not God. Some of them think that he didn't die and rise again. Because if the saints defect, if the church takes on dogmatic error, it's not the church anymore. The gates of hell have prevailed. But now let's take one of these, small t traditions, some, relatively minor historical point. One of my favorites to talk about is I find it interesting, is, in First Kingdoms, or in some Bibles, the book of First Samuel, chapter 28, you have the witch of Endor calls up the spirit of the prophet Samuel after he's already died, because King Saul wants a word from the prophet, to tell him what's going to happen. And we see in the text of scripture that, there's this apparition, this voice of some sort. And so there was a great controversy over that. We talk about the consensus of the saints, but on this particular topic, the saints were all over the map. You have, three different views out there. Some of the saints just took it at face value, and they said that this woman actually called Samuel forth from the dead, and he came and gave a message. So this would be like Justin Martyr, Ambrose, Augustine. You have another group of saints, including John Chrysostom and Theodoret, saying that whether it was Samuel or whether it was a demon, the spirit of Samuel, we don't know whether that spirit was Samuel or whether it was just a demon impersonating him, but it appeared at God's bidding and not by some bidding of the woman. And then you have a third group of saints, which is the biggest, saying that it was not Samuel at all, it was a demon who deceived Saul and gave him a false prophecy. And this group would include Hippolytus, Ephraim the Syrian, Evagrius, Basil, Jerome, Ambrosiaster, Gregory of Nyssa. And, so just on the face of it, you say, first of all, they're all over the map. Well, how could that be? How could they be all over the map on something? Well, how important is this? What are the stakes if you get this wrong? If you say, I think it's for real. I think that the witch of Endor actually called up his spirit from the dead, and you're wrong. It was a demon. Well, you'll get corrected whenever you get to heaven, but you're not going to be barred entry to heaven because you missed that question on the test.
Right.
Likewise, what if you say, you know what, I'm going to go with the majority of the saints on this one. I think that this was not real. I think once you're dead, we look in Luke 16 and there's this great chasm between, one side and the other side, and surely they can't have come to earth. So yeah, I'm just going to say that was a demon. It was not actually Samuel. It was a demon that was impersonating him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I turn out to be wrong, again, Samuel's going to walk up to me in heaven and say, hey, dude, that was me. That wasn't no demon.
Right.
But you're not going to be barred entry into heaven because of that. So, just by the very nature of it, the tiniest historical details, the most insignificant questions, you can be wrong on it, and it does not affect your standing in the church. You're not going to be filtered out. You're not going to be excommunicated or thrown out or have, masses of people, cursing you because you're a false teacher. Now, those are the two extremes. Those are the two bookends. The deity of Christ is at one extreme. The saints are unanimous on that. Whether this spirit was actually Samuel or not is at the other extreme. It's interesting, and it has some importance, and I would rather get it right than get it wrong, but you can get it wrong all day long. 100 saints could get it wrong all day long. And it's not going to make them false teachers. It's not going to bar them entry to heaven. So there's room in the church for error on small things, and I thank God for that. Otherwise, I would never make it to heaven, ever.
Right.
There is room for error. It doesn't mean that we embrace it or that we want it or that we look for it. It just means you don't have to be right about everything. And on this particular minor point about, was it Samuel, was it a demon? I think we can actually solve that problem in a very simple way that I wish the saints had thought of, but they didn't. And that's this particular question is actually answered in a different part of Scripture. And so, and it's just kind of it's just interesting. But if you go to the book of Sirach in the Old Testament, chapter 46, it actually answers the question. It says, before the time of his eternal sleep, Samuel bore witness before the Lord. And then a verse later, it says, even after he had fallen asleep, he prophesied and made known to the king his death and lifted up his voice from the ground in prophecy to blot out the lawlessness of the people. So you have a really explicit statement from a passage of Scripture in the Old Testament that's not very widely known, are not familiar with that particular verse. And apparently, the particular saints that were opposed to this idea were not familiar with that one verse. And it's one of the cases, this doesn't always work, but it's one of the cases where you can actually find a source that will kind of clear everything up for you. You can say, okay, now I know which side to pick. Yeah. But I don't feel any worse about that list of saints that happen to get it wrong, because it's not a core, it's not a core doctrine that's going, that the faith stands or falls on. And where things get hairy, where things get fuzzy is the muddle in the middle. The doctrines that are really important, the things that we care about, the things that if you get wrong, it can mess with your life, but you wouldn't quite call them dogma either. They're not, there's something that you don't want to get wrong, but even if you get it wrong, you're not going to be cast out of heaven for it. So, and I'm sure we'll get into more of those details as we go farther into the show. But
interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.